Welcome back to day 9 of our 31-day Halloween story spookathon. I have a guilty little pleasure this time of year. I love Halloween story anthologies. Last year, I discovered the anthology series, Walking After Midnight, Tales for Halloween. I really enjoyed all the stories, so when I approached Miss Camby about reading one of her stories, it was so difficult to choose. Ultimately, I chose HAYRIDE from the anthology Walking After Midnight, Book 1, written by Camby. The ground was frozen under the Schultz's feet as they wandered through the rows of apple trees at Uncle Jay's orchard. The fall air around them was not merely crisp, it had a bite. Wind ripped through their jackets as Mrs. Schultz held their 6-year-old daughter's hand and a basket of Michigan Gala apples. Mr. Schultz wore a camera on a thick strap around his neck and had an arm around their 12-year-old daughter, much to her chagrin. Blades of grass mixed with frozen dew and mud covered the bottom and sides of their shoes. As chilly as it was, the sunset provided some welcome warmth, and their cheeks were rosy pink. Mrs. Schultz lifted the 6-year-old up as she approached a tree so ripe with apples that the branches nearly dragged the ground. "Grab it, Maddie. Good girl," she said as the girl dropped the apple into the basket with a smile on her face. The 12-year-old shrugged her dad's arm off and said, "Don't we have enough apples yet?" Her father grinned. "The best trees are in the back." "Emma, you love this place." "What's wrong?" her mother asked. Emma rolled her eyes as Maddie came running towards her, attaching herself like a suckerfish to Emma's leg. "More apples!" Emma smiled and gave in. "All right, more apples." Madison grabbed her hand and led the way. Their parents stood back and watched, sharing a smile in recognition of the friendship between the girls. While pregnant with their youngest, Mrs. Schultz had worried about the age gap between them, but it had not proven itself a problem. "Where's the fire, Maddie?" Mr. Schultz asked as the girls ran off between the apple trees, giggling. The parents followed along, and as they rounded the corner, their daughters were nowhere to be found. "Girls, where are you?" Mrs. Schultz cried out. No answer. Their parents quickened their pace and looked from side to side between the trees as they shuffled down the rows. "Madison! Emma! Where did you go?" their father bellowed. A tiny cry came from several rows away, and the parents exchanged a terrified glance before sprinting in its direction. The parents ran through several rows of apple trees before they found the girls standing next to a sign reading "Hayrides, $5, and chatting with a bearded man in brown work coveralls. Their mother snipped, "Never run off like that." Their father was bent over, catching his breath, nodding in agreement. "Mommy, hayrides!" Madison yelled back, as if to say, "You idiots, I was doing important work here." Emma smirked and shrugged her shoulders, which was as much enthusiasm as they had seen from her in months. The bearded man spoke up. "Ah, that'd be one Mr. Lincoln for a ride. I'm Lon." He smiled, stepping forward. He extended his hand. "Mr. Schultz. Mark's fine, though." Their father wiped some sweat off his forehead and asked, "Is this new? We've never seen hayrides out here before." Lon smiled. "Brand new." Mrs. Schultz, now recovered from the earlier panic, nudged her husband. "Can't beat $5. That's cheaper than the movies." Her husband nodded but never broke eye contact with the bearded man, whose dark eyes were deep-set like black coals in their sockets. A tiny wrist tugged at his arm. "Please?" He looked down at Madison's face and then back up at the man. "I don't know, sweetie. It's almost dark. They'll be closed soon. He looked back down at her tiny smile. Don't you still want hot cider before we go? She shook her head and her ponytail bobbed with it. Hayride. His wife and older daughter looked at him with hopeful faces. You're not too cold, Jan? He asked. Blankets in the wagon, straw too. Pretty warm if you ask me, the man said, rubbing his hands together and winking at Janice Schultz. She blushed. Mr. Schultz gave in and grabbed his wallet from his back pocket, fished out $5, and placed it in the man's gloved paw. All right, then, let's load her up, Lon roared with glee, flinging the gate of the wagon open and beckoning them in. The suburban family crawled awkwardly into the pile of straw and sat in pairs facing each other, sitting cross-legged with their backs against the red wooden railing. Their driver took a seat on the tractor and revved the engine, throwing a large flannel blanket back at his passengers. Lon pressed the gas without restraint. The Schultzes jerked backward and shared a laugh as they covered themselves with the blanket. Hang on, folks! The family was all smiles, punctuated by the wagon bobbing as it rolled through the outskirts of the orchard. They were at the top of a small hill, riding next to the fence marking the property. The blanket did much to keep them warm, and as they took in the spectacular autumn sunset, the sweet, smoky smell of a nearby bonfire enveloped them. Maybe we'll make it back in time for cider, Mrs. Schultz said to the girls, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. For once, the girl did not flinch, but leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. The parents exchanged a happy, if shocked, look. This is what it's all about, Mr. Schultz thought, leaning back and breathing in a huge gulp of autumn air. A sudden jolt caused him to jerk his eyes open. The tractor was now at the bottom of the hill and seemed to slow. He must be taking us back to the entrance gate. Nice touch. I should tip that bearded weirdo. Craning his neck, he realized they were not anywhere near the gate. They were in the remote northwest corner, as far away from the entrance as they could be, yet the tractor was slowing. Mr. Schultz groaned at the thought of the long walk back in the cold air. There goes your tip. Mrs. Schultz opened her mouth to speak as the wagon turned a sharp corner. They all turned their heads to see where they were going. The tractor had exited through a small gap in the fence surrounding the orchard, and they were now riding in the grass next to a cornfield neighboring the property. Excuse me? Mr. Schultz said. Lon did not respond. Lon? No answer. The tractor sped up. They were now just past the fence and entering a wooded area behind the orchard. And the tractor was moving at quite a clip, approaching a bridge in severe disrepair. Mrs. Schultz's eyes widened when she saw where they were headed, and she spoke up. Lon, we need to head back. Again, the tractor sped up. They were within feet of a bridge ill-equipped for their weight. She sat up, frantic, and looked around to get her bearings. We could tuck and roll, she thought for a moment, before realizing that Emma was far too small to make the jump at this speed without seriously injuring herself. But they would be in even worse shape if the wagon fell through the bridge into the icy water 40 feet below. Jagged limestone rocks lined the riverbed, and the river was as cold as it was shallow. Her husband saw where they were heading and sat up, leaning forward to grab the back of Lon's coveralls. As he did, the tractor went over a large hole in the ground and he missed, toppling forward, his torso trapped between the tractor and the wagon. Instinctively, he put his hands in front of him to catch himself, and they landed on the chain that hitched the two together. The tractor went over another large hole, and he cried out in pain as the chain links pinched the flesh of his fingers. Mark! Janice shouted. The girls screamed, "Dad, stop, mister! You're hurting him!" With one hand firm on the wooden rails of the wagon, their mom reached with the other hand and grabbed her husband's belt loop, pulling him back inside. He sat back down and exhaled in temporary relief. "What do we do?" he asked her. Lon would not respond to their pleas, and the tractor was moving faster than ever. They were now mere feet from the bridge. With no other options, Janice spoke up. "Girls," she shook their hands, "just hang on. When we get across the bridge, I want you to stand up and jump out. Jump as far away from the wagon as you can, okay?" Madison whimpered, and Emma hugged her tight, tears pooling in their matching hazel eyes. Their parents formed a huddle around them and looked at each other in silent, morbid acknowledgement that the bridge would not hold their weight. The time to panic was over. All that was left in their parenting arsenal was keeping the girls calm. A creaking sound came from the tractor's front wheels as they crossed the bridge. The Schultz family closed their eyes and held on to each other, jumping slightly at each board they crossed. The tractor labored up and then heaved down each rotting inch of the bridge. The chain link railing clanked against the metal rods, holding it in place as the back right tire slipped into a slot between the steps, and they gasped, tightening their grips on each other. Lon pressed the gas harder, and the tractor pulled the wagon out from between the boards. But not before the board they had just ridden over fell off from the bridge and shattered on the rocks below. Mercifully, they felt the front tires of the tractor hit solid ground. Janice opened one reluctant eye through her grimace and gasped a sigh of relief. The others heard her and opened their eyes, exhaling. The tractor sped up again as it left the bridge. "Now remember what I told you, girls. Jump as far away from the wheels as you can," Janice said. "When you land, run as fast as you can back to the orchard. Follow the river back north. It will lead you back to the road, and that will lead you to the orchard. Don't wait for your mother and I. Just go," Mark said. The girls looked at him, equal parts terrified and unsure. "Go," he shouted, and Janice winced. The tractor sped up, and the girls shared a knowing look. "Maddie, we're going to count to 3. Hold my hand real tight and jump as far as you can, okay?" The little girl nodded. 1, 2, 3. The girls held hands and jumped out of the speeding wagon. They cleared the wheels, and their parents heaved relieved sighs, hugging each other. Emma and Madison took one look back at their parents before making a run for it along the right bank of the river. Their driver felt the weight of the wagon shift and whipped his head back, enraged. Mark was still watching the girls run when he heard his wife let out a chilling shriek. He followed her saucer-wide gaze to the driver, who was staring back at them. Lon's face was nothing but gray, rotting flesh hanging off a skeletal frame. His mouth was open, the bottom half of his jaw hanging down like a ventriloquist dummy. The only thing matching the man's earlier appearance were the dark eyes and teeth like jagged piano keys. Mark was temporarily frozen in horror. Once his mind registered what it had seen, he turned to his wife, who was clinging to his jacket like a vice. The tractor sped up further. "We have to jump," he yelled. Janice nodded, her mouth and eyes wide open. They stood trying to maintain balance as the wagon shook on the dirt path and steadied themselves for the jump. "Ready?" she asked. He nodded, grabbing her hand. "We must be going 50 miles an hour, he thought, as he looked below them at the rock-spotted ground. 1, 2, 3, they yelled together and jumped out of the wagon. The blanket caught Janice's ankle, pulling her back so that she caught on the railing and toppled, head over feet, the back left wheel barely missing her head. Mark landed ahead of her and looked back, panicked. He scrambled towards her as she sat up, brushing dirt and leaves off of her clothes. "Are you okay?" She nodded and looked up at the tractor, which had not slowed down. "He hasn't noticed we're gone?" "I'm not sure." Mark shook his head, breathless. "Either way, we need to find the girls before he turns around in that thing and runs us down." They took off along the bank of the river, faster than either of them had run in decades, in the orchard's direction. The scent of hot apple cider hit Mr. and Mrs. Schultz as they staggered into the barn at the entrance of the orchard, and the once inviting smell now nauseated them. Emma and Madison sat in front of a fire on a hay bale with a plaid blanket wrapped around their shoulders. Mrs. J walked up to the girls, handing them 2 mugs with steam rising from them. Uncle Jay, the owner of the orchard, was pacing to the side of the fire. He spotted Mark and Janice and began walking towards the couple. In a tone quiet enough so the girls would not hear him, but with enough force to convey his anger, he demanded, "Where the hell have you been? The property line ends at the fence. And did I hear you stole one of my tractors?" Mark shook his head in bewilderment. "Stole a tractor?" He pointed a finger at Jay's chest. "I should sue your ass for not running a background check on the jerks you hire to work at this joint." "Now wait a minute." "No," Mark cried. "Do you know how dangerous that bridge is? I can't believe we made it over. We could have been killed. My girls must be traumatized." He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. Janice squeezed his other hand before running over to the girls, crouching down to hug them both. Jay squinted, creating deep lines on his forehead. "Are you saying one of my employees took you out on my tractor?" Mark looked down at his clothes before shooting him a look that said, "Exactly what about my Vineyard Vines jacket makes you think I know how to drive a tractor?" Jay nodded and closed his eyes. "Ma," he yelled to his wife, who was sitting with the girls. She looked up at him, and he shook his head like a man resigned to a grim fate. Mrs. J brought one hand to her mouth as her face twisted in worry before running into the farmhouse behind them. Mark looked around in utter confusion. What the hell is going on here? Wait, you know what? Don't bother, because I'm calling the cops myself and— "Hold on, son," Jay said. He heaved a loaded sigh before continuing. "Why don't you come with me?" He put one arm on Mark's shoulder and gestured with the other to walk. Janice saw the two walking toward the garage and made a concerned face at Mark, who held up one finger, signaling that he would be back soon. The men loaded into Jay's truck and pulled out of the garage. Taking a sharp right, Jay began. "Mr. Schultz, years ago, when I first opened this place up to families, I thought hayrides would fit right in." He turned again and then traveled along the fence to the other side of the orchard. Mark looked to the right and saw the place where they had departed on the hellish hayride earlier. Son of a bitch, already took the sign down, covering his tracks. Jay continued as they followed the fence all the way to the opening at the far northwest corner of the orchard where the tractor had led them into the woods. "I hired this guy Lon to run the rides. He was a little slow, I knew it, but we only needed him to drive along the fence inside the orchard. Take $5 per wagon full? It wasn't like I hired him to file my taxes." Mark looked at the man driving him. Despite his anger, he felt a sudden pulling pity towards the farmer. Jay's face was drawn long in a combination of exhaustion and worry. Mark realized they were approaching the bridge. Anyhow, Jay shifted the truck into park. People seemed to like it. We made a little money on the rides, but that wasn't the point. The orchard brings in enough money that the rides were just something extra for the kids. Follow me. He got out of the truck and walked towards the bridge in the dark. Mark's stomach flipped on itself. Dueling banjos played in his ears. Stop it, he told himself. Reluctantly, he followed. As he approached, Jay stopped right at the entrance of the bridge and took his hat off, wringing it in his hands. My family is back at the house. There are witnesses. His mind and heart raced as he approached the farmer who was standing with his back to him. When Mark reached him, he followed Jay's eyes to the river below. The remains of a rusty tractor rested on the riverbed, its crumpled machinery draped over the jagged rocks. The bottom half was submerged and icy water flowed over what was left of the padded driver's seat. Mark's eyes went wide. The crazy bastard must have crashed on the way back. But the realization hit him that no one could survive that fall. It was a 40-foot drop to less than 3 feet of ice water and jagged rocks. He looked at Jay, who was studying the wreckage. A few years after we hired him on, we had a terrible year. Summer was unseasonably cold. The apples didn't grow like they normally do. We went bare bones. People could come pick apples, but we didn't run the hayrides or have any of the games and concessions we do now. We were cash poor, like plenty of other farmers. Jay turned to face him. Lon took it poorly. One day I heard my tractor starting in the garage. I ran outside to follow in my truck, and sure enough, Lon was hauling ass off to the woods. I tried to cut him off, but he was too far ahead, and I didn't want to run him over. He just kept going. I yelled that the bridge wouldn't hold, but he either couldn't or wouldn't hear me. Mark turned to look at the bridge for the first time since Jay had driven them out there. Only a few splintered boards remained, suspended by the chain links. He blinked to be sure of what he saw. The bridge was impassable and clearly had been for years. What boards remained were covered in deep green moss, some attached by only one corner to the railing. He opened his mouth to speak, but Jay cut him off. Tractor fell right through the bridge. Jay finally looked up at Mark. That was it for Lon. But I don't remember seeing anything about this in the papers. I mean, how? Mark let out a puzzled gasp. Kept it quiet. I have a cousin at the County Gazette. Mark was enraged. Bullshit! He screamed, heading back for the truck. Jay charged after him, grabbing one shoulder to turn him around. Look at the damn bridge, Mr. Schultz. The one you said your entire family went over this evening. He shoved Mark forward. Now you tell me which one of us is a liar. Mark turned to look at the old farmer and found him with his arms folded and his face resting with a kind of dreary satisfaction. The man was telling the truth, but he did not look happy about it. Jay nodded his head towards the truck. Get in. I'll take us back. Mark followed, saying nothing until they pulled into the garage. What do I tell them? He asked, embarrassed at how powerless and weak his voice sounded. The farmer thought for a moment. That we went looking for the guy, but couldn't find him. Tell him we called the cops, whatever you need to do to make your family feel safe. Jay gave a ghost of a smile and patted his passenger on the shoulder before turning off the car and getting out. Mark nodded, but he felt numb all over. He walked toward the Schultz women and gave the explanation Jay suggested. After saying their goodbyes and thanking the farmer for his help, he gathered the girls, drowsy from their ordeal and the warmth of the fire, and led them back to the car. "Well?" his wife whispered once they buckled the girls in. "What happened?" "I told you, we couldn't find him." Her face became stern. "You're lying." He shut the van door so the girls couldn't hear and looked down at his feet. "The bridge was gone." "What bridge? The bridge we went over?" She shook her head. "It must have gone out after we went over it. Oh God, what if that had happened when we were on it, Mark? The girls—" "Jan, no. It's rotted and busted. It's been out for years." Even in the dim light of the fire burning in front of their car, he could see the color drain from her face. "That's not possible. We drove over it today." He threw his hands up. "I'm just telling you what I saw. I want to go home now." She stared back in disbelief. "Can we please just get some sleep? All of this will seem better in the morning, I promise you," he insisted. Back at the bridge, he had resolved not to tell her anything about what happened to Lon, still clinging to the hope that the whole thing was an old ghost story Jay told people to keep them from trespassing. "Will it, Mark?" Janice shook her head as she climbed into the passenger seat. She buckled her seatbelt and stared straight ahead. "I'm not sure I believe that." "That's 10 years in a row," Mrs. J admonished her husband and slid a piece of apple pie over to him at the kitchen table. He took a bite and nodded. "Mm-hmm." She wiped both hands on her bright red apron and put them on her hips. "I don't know about all this." He swallowed and looked up at her. "He bought it. It'll work itself out, Ma." "I can't stop picturing those little girls all crumpled up down in the riverbed," she said, raising one hand to cover her mouth. Jay brought one fist down on the table with a thump. "Lon stole the tractor." Another thump. "Lon took them over the bridge." A final deafening thump. "I told him it wouldn't hold any weight." "What about the family?" "That's on Lon's conscience, isn't it?" he snapped. She winced at the tone of his voice, inhaling sharply. Mrs. J untied the apron strings from around her back, wiped her face, and composed herself before adding her final thoughts on the matter. "It's the girls I feel sorry for, that's all." Jay took another bite of pie, and the prongs of the fork clinked dully against his teeth. Hanging the apron on a hook behind the kitchen door, she turned to face him. "Well then, I'm going to bed," she eked out with a tight-lipped smile. "Huh," he responded, not looking up from the pie. Mrs. J sat at the mahogany vanity table in their bedroom and reached for the sterling brush she had used on her hair every single night for 35 years. She looked at her wrinkles in the mirror as she ran it through the gray, web-like strands. On the 10th swipe, she brought the brush down to her lap and looked at the knob on the drawer in front of her. She set the brush back on the table and drew a ragged breath before reaching one shaky hand to open the drawer, where she pulled out a newspaper clipping, faded with age and folded neatly into quarters. Her lips moved as she read the words for the 100th time. "Farmhand, family of 4 perish in grisly accident." I hope you enjoyed this story. I certainly did. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend. If you'd like to read more by author Evan Camby, check out all 3 books in her Walking After Midnight series. You won't regret it. I've read 2 out of the 3, and they are the perfect stories to read this time of year. Most of them are Halloween themed. I'll leave a link down below for you to purchase those. All right, Rosebuds, that's a wrap. Until tomorrow night, take care and stay creepy.